Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Alison Elliott and I'm an ACECQA board member, and it's a great thrill to be here at this inaugural conference and to see so many familiar faces and to see and hear about the amazing work everyone's doing around the National Quality Framework. We've just heard Karen's wonderful presentation about embracing change, and we're going to continue with that theme for the next 90 minutes. I know was particularly attracted to her idea about the topiary and bringing it to life in the Tassie maze. So hopefully we'll continue with that notion of change over the next 90 minutes. Exploring stories of change is going to be enlightening and exciting. We'll be hearing from organisations and what they've done to support the implementation of the National Quality Framework. We're very excited to have a number of presenters who are going to be sharing their experience with us today as part of this session, and their presentations are as diverse as their backgrounds. I hope their stories will challenge your mindset and give you the courage and knowledge to try something new, and we got started there in that previous session. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage our conference MC and facilitator for this session, Nigel Collin. Welcome, Nigel, and over to you to facilitate the discussion.
Thank you very much, Alison. Would you please thank Alison for the words? I think this is going to be a fantastic session. I loved Karen's presentation, and you know, change is doable, and I think one of the wonderful things about a session like this is hearing the stories of others. In the other session this morning, we were talking about an old tutor of mine said we are genetically engineered to understand stories. So to hear the perspective and stories from a range of people is just an absolutely wonderful opportunity. So I hope you take notes, because I think we're really in for an absolute treat. On that note, just to let you know how this is going to run, we're putting all of our presenters under a little bit of pressure. Because each of them have only 15 minutes in which to tell their stories and to present. Now, I don't know about you, but saying anything in just 15 minutes is really hard. But what that does for us, it allows us to really concisely understand the stories and draw from them the lessons that we need to learn. So it's kind of like the TED Talk phenomenon, if you're familiar with that. I think 15 minutes is hard for the presenters to do, but it's wonderful for us to hear. So it's going to be an absolutely brilliant afternoon. I thank you all for putting in the effort of concisely getting things together. So I think we should move on with the session. First up, we're going to look at continuous quality improvement, constantly changing things in a much better way. To do that, come to us all the way from Bond University is Caroline Fuster. So would you please join me in welcoming Caroline to the stage.
Thank you very much for your warm welcome. It's always a worry when you clap when I haven't done anything. So I'm going to talk about, I'm sure the PowerPoint will come up very soon, about professional development as a source of inspiration for educators making changes to their environments. And my particular area today is spaces and places for babies and toddlers. So I'm going to talk about 3 different models of professional learning opportunities, all based in Western Australia. And there are, in fact, 3 models I'm going to talk about, but they are all ongoing professional learning opportunities. And of course, as you know, the research indicates that that commitment to ongoing learning has very positive results. So I'm very proud on behalf of many educators in Western Australia to present their stories. I have to move the button. Okay, so the presentation highlights educator stories of meeting change head-on through the process of professional learning, and the particular quality area is quality area 3, the physical environment. The first one is in leading the way in WA. I hadn't realised it rhymes, so that's good. And this is a project that is a voluntary professional learning project. It's a strategic project. 3 university centres got together and said, we need to take a leadership role. And so they have researched, their processes they have used is they have researched national, international information. They have visited the eastern states. They have brought back just wonderful ideas and have implemented many changes into their environments. And now, through some from state government lottery funding, they are able to share those changes with other services for free. So you can see in this photograph that some of the areas that they have made changes to are things like the texture, the colour, the individual spaces, the comfort for educators and families. They've made tremendous changes. All the children sit up at the high table as if they were having dinner at home or in a 5-star restaurant. So they have made significant changes to the physical environment as a result of this project. The next one, that was Curtin University Early Learning Centre. You can see this first space I would like to talk about is the space where families and children can be together. What they have done here is they have some family photos and a sign-in sheet. They've really reflected on their practice, and now what they do is they've created a family area. It's called the Family Story Area. One of the things they do, instead of a lot of information and a fairly basic office-like approach, is to make an area where the families are recording stories on a CD. And those lovely lounge chairs are an opportunity for children to sit with their families and record stories. It means children can listen to their first language throughout the day. It also means that the children can listen to their families all day because we have it recorded on a CD. So you can see that the space has changed dramatically and has a very good reason, because it's including children and families in the learning and the curriculum. Immediately they come to there. Each family is invited to read stories and messages and songs, and they can listen to them, especially at rest time. They love to hear their family stories. We often have listening posts with baby and toddler earphones, and you can see their faces light up when they hear their families, especially good when they're crying as well. The next one is the routines, the baby routines. What they have done is to make some changes to the routines with families. Normally, the baby's room routine would be children arrive, there's a nappy change, there's morning tea, there's free play. You can see that a particular routine for each child is written by the families. And the families keep changing. This is ongoing learning. So the families are always contributing to the baby's change in routines. And we have them posted on the room and in a basket so children can carry them round. And sometimes put them on the mats and they look at themselves on the photograph and they never want to listen to the story. They'd rather look at themselves, that beautiful stage of identity in practice. So they're making many, many changes. This is a continuing program. But there is a big difference because the families are so involved in the routines. And it's estimated that when we work with babies and toddlers, 70% of the day is in a routine situations. And so that's a wonderful change that they've made to reflect some learning and to really get families involved. This is something from listening to families more often, is a lovely thing that these twins came into the service and they had never slept apart. And so by asking the families to look at the routines, they now can follow that routine. If they hadn't asked the families about the routine, they may not have been able to have that practice. So having families involved in what actually happens with very young children has been a very popular move with families. Creating a welcoming environment, just one little area is there where they pick up their photographs and they can carry themselves inside. Just a very simple idea, but it's at the front door where children can pick up their photographs and take them on a journey for the day, starting the day. Everybody has a different view of welcoming environment, but toddlers love to carry things round. And so they have very carefully created an area that welcomes children, where children are involved immediately. The first documentation for this particular service is that we are looking at having a learning story and a learning message to families about 3 to 4 weeks when the baby has started. And we send out a lovely learning message by email or by whichever communication method you prefer, and we talk about what the baby has learnt in the first 3 weeks. So we can call that a transition learning message to families. It's a way of documenting children's learning, which is so significant. So every family would love to know in the first few weeks how the baby has settled in, or the toddler. And we can use that. So actual evidence of children's learning is recorded and given to families. Another change. The next one is an action research project, and Karen used these terminologies in her change presentation. And it's the story, this was an action research project where educators from regional and Perth area were asked to come in, and we worked together for 3 full days, and then I visited their services, and these are some of the results of the action research. And so the first case study is the story of the changes that educators made in looking at promoting social learning with babies and toddlers. And one of the things that were there was they were setting up the beds in a row, and the children just wanted the educator. She made dramatic changes. She puts the beds out in a circle like this and sat in the middle and engaged with the children, just what they wanted. And I said to her at this time, in fact, I'm so thrilled that you have done this, because I've only been an early childhood educator for 100 years, and not one child has ever rushed up to me and said, "Caroline, put that rainforest music on. It's great." Not one. So what we have here is the process of change, is that educators recognised that they were working on assumed practices rather than looking for evidence, looking at what children's needs are, what they really wanted to do. So that was very amazing. So another case study is a similar one where they're looking at the spaces, and they looked at the social interactions, and it was when they were grouping the children together. So you can read the slide and have a look. She looked very quickly at the personal spaces. She said that the mat time doesn't work. So what she did was to create mats individually for each child, put their photographs on it, and sometimes they were there 2 hours before. They were so excited to have their own space. And so these are quite dramatic changes, not only in educator practices, but in many other areas as well. So an action research defines stop, continue, start. That process was moving from assumption-based practice to evidence-based practice. Very exciting. The last one is a Pilbara project, where is a beautiful remote area in Western Australia. And this is a professional development program where we have used a strategy is how do we provide spaces and places that promote safe exploration and learning through play and interactions with the environment for babies and toddlers. So we're looking at what we did was to create a marketplace of possibilities. So I travelled to the Pilbara with 70 kilos of luggage. That's why Qantas, their shares have gone up, because I love to carry resources. It's amazing. So we've had the most wonderful time. We're in the middle of this project, and I'm so thrilled because Tracy here lives at Tom Price, one tiny little service, and the educators have really embraced this program. It's been fantastic, and fantastic for me as well. These are some of the marketplace of possibilities that we're looking at in the context of the community. And we're looking at natural materials, we're looking at colour, design, features, textures, we're looking at sensorial learning, we're looking just at possibilities, not that there's one right way, but just a feast of opportunities. And you can see for babies and toddlers, we're looking at floor spaces, we're looking at texture, we're looking and thinking differently about toddler and baby learning. So you can see I gave them a set of postcards so that they're postcards of possibilities with just lots of different concepts for baby and toddler environments. The last one is, look what happened within a week. Somebody has made a scarecrow with the mining outfit. And the scarecrow and the garden, you can see there's not much growing there. I know it's the Pilbara, but the babies have eaten the lettuce already. So, but what a wonderful project, and the parents are very involved. Now they're planting vertical gardens on the fence with the mining boots from the families. We've got everybody involved. It's a fantastic project. And of course they don't have the access to things. If you order a cupboard, it costs $1,000 to get to Tracy's. It might cost us $50 in a city. So I'm totally inspired, and I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. And I would like to finish by saying what we talk about change is that often we talk about it, but I want you to celebrate it as well, because there are so many wonderful things going on with the implementation of the National Quality Framework. So I'm going to finish with a little story. And it's a story about a Friday conversation where I group children together to review the week. I always call it a Friday conversation. We listen to the children, and that forms a lovely platform for our planning for the future week, or planning for the next week. And we talk and talk and talk. And there are 2 children in this little group who are unable to speak. And I don't think they can speak at all, ever. So I give them a camera so that they can bring their ideas to the conversation. And one day, a little boy said to me, "Caroline, those photographs, my dad could put them on PowerPoint." What that little boy was doing was advocating for his friends. It was a moment where I say change is worth celebrating. And I said to him, "I'm so thrilled that you have done this. Thank you." I acknowledged it. And he turned to me and he said, "That's what friends are supposed to do." And I was delighted. And I said, "I know a song about that. Let's celebrate." And here is the song. And every time we have the conversation on Fridays, we have this song. I hope you enjoy it. Ready, Mr. Music? Are you ready? We like it loud.
And I know when
everybody,
I can
count on you like
4, 3, 2.
I'll be there.
'Cause that's what friends are supposed to do.
Oh yeah.
Ooh, ooh, yeah, yeah. If you toss tossing and you're turning and you just can't fall asleep, I'll sing a song beside you. And if you ever forget how much you really mean to me, every day I will remind you.
Caroline, thank you so much. Celebrate change. What a fantastic presentation. Pressure, I think, for everybody else. Thanks again. Our next presentation is a double-hander. In other words, there are two presenters, Christine Harrison and Barbara Langford from Montessori, Australia, to tell us the story, really, their story of Montessori's community, or Montessori community's NQF journey. So I noticed they're taking the stage. Would you please warmly welcome both Christine and Barbara to the podium.
Thank you very much. I wish I'd learned how to do some dancing now, but maybe later. Maybe when we go off we can do a bit of it. Yeah, okay, fair enough. So you may be wondering why there's two of us up here. Well, the Montessori sector, as some of you may know, is actually quite broad and diverse. There are preschools, public schools, childcare centres, independent schools, and we've got Montessori in quite a few Indigenous communities now. My background's really with schools and preschools, and Barb's is predominantly in childcare. We're going to quickly run through our journey over the last few years. If we got the click up. Dr. Maria Montessori. 100 years ago, Dr. Montessori developed a unique method of education. It was based on scientific research about children's development. She was a medical doctor and an anthropologist. The effectiveness of this method has now been confirmed by the latest brain research, particularly concerning the importance of skills that are developed for 21st century living. That's where the Montessori lesson ends. We were quite happy in our little Montessori bubble, as I'm sure most of you are or were in your little bubbles around the country. Sure, we had some difficulties with accreditors and advisors, but in the main, we developed quite comfortable relationships, which at best enabled us to go through a process of validation or licensing every so often. We didn't really believe that any of the regulators understood Montessori. How could they? And sometimes it felt like a battle. It wasn't only me that ended up with white hair, I can tell you that. And then came along the National Quality Agenda, and that's where we get the drum roll. It did feel a bit like that. Another change, another hoop to jump through. More paperwork, possibly more scrutiny. No one really understanding, again, what we do. Please, government representatives to explain ourselves to. Our immediate thoughts were, why should we change? Montessori curriculum has been around for a long time. It goes from birth to 18 years. We're the largest single pedagogy in the whole world. It's found in over 110 countries and applied to over 22,000 schools throughout the world. And that's a map of where you can find Montessori throughout the world. I think it would be safe to say that we were not happy. At this stage, the prospect of change felt quite confronting and unsettling, and we certainly received a lot of negative murmurs from our community. This slide uses some very positive language and some positive words. We knew the theory, sure. You know, we all like change. I've read books about change and all the theory. But really, this was the reality. You know, how should we embrace change? But it felt like another battle for us still. So you can see we were still feeling a bit negative. I guess our epiphany began late one Saturday sitting in an airport lounge. We spent a lot of time in airport lounges. We just visited a Montessori centre where they had purchased a how to do the NQF and the EYLF manual and a whole set of processes and procedures, which, well, they felt needed some Montessori input. And that's why we were there. I guess we felt that there must be a better way to empower our community rather than make them feel that they were actually just taking in information. We have to do something, we said. Well, we didn't really know at that stage the journey that we were going on. And I think it took us about an hour, and we, you know, it's amazing what you can do in an hour, really. It was time to take the bull by the horns, basically. We identified the task ahead, and we wanted to focus really on how to make a difference. So, sorry, I'll just go back. What were our aims? To remove the fear, to give the correct information. There were a lot of myths and certainly more realities than myths, and I'm sure some of you experienced that. You know, they're not going to allow us to grow tomato plants anymore. You know, the whole playground has to be redesigned. They don't like Montessori. You're going to get someone coming in and saying, we don't like Montessori, so therefore you're never going to get anywhere. All of those things were going around, and we had lots of stories to tell. But we wanted to try and empower our community, remember. So we wanted to identify how Montessori fits with the NQF, to help educators to implement the change, to inspire educators to embrace, and I like those words, inspiration and embrace, and to inform ACECQA about Montessori and our early years learning program. So this was the first of our series of workshops which we held in every state, more time in the airport lounges. We were becoming quite emboldened, I guess, and ambitious. And quite frankly, there was a part of us that felt quite sceptical. We weren't truly there either, but we felt we really had to do something. We put ourselves up as mediators of change, and we had to remain positive. So we invited an assessor from each state, usually a lead assessor, to come along to all of these sessions. They were the ones that had to face the music, not us. And they did, I must say, they did a fantastic job, even though at that stage, some of them hadn't finished their training. And, you know, that was, I think that sold a lot of people on the journey. I'm going to hand over to Barb now.
So what we found from the feedback of the people we were talking to was that they were after something tangible. And one of the things that we did early in the piece was to remember that prior to the NQF was also the Early Years Learning Framework, which had been introduced earlier, and in fact people should already have been implementing, but a lot of people were going, what is it? So one of the first tasks we had was to convince the Montessori community that actually Montessori herself could have written the EYLF, that in fact the outcomes of what we strive for in our practice is actually the same. And the first thing we did was to develop a poster which basically charted what we talk about in the language of Montessori and how that related to the outcomes of the Early Years Learning Framework. That was also to help start some conversations in the centres, but also for parents too, to see that we're taking this on board and that the curriculum that they had signed up to was in fact meeting that outcome. Oops, sorry. I don't expect that you'll read all these things, but I'm just going to show you some examples. So we created some documents for the staff to also start to take some sense of control. Again, we didn't want to produce this is how you do it document, but we wanted to look at each of the elements in of the Early Years Learning Framework. We wanted to show how Montessori actually does do that, even though it might look slightly different to how another centre may do it. And so in actual fact, we wanted the staff in the centres to actually own that and decide that they were doing it and to identify how they were doing that. We really felt it was important for the centres to take ownership, and that was one of our aims, was to empower them with these documents to take it on themselves. So having done the EYLF, next, of course, comes the National Quality Standards. Now, put your hand up if you can remember the drafts of the draft documents that came out. And then there was the draft, and then you could go to, a workshop where you could put in a submission about the draft, and so it went. And keep your hand up if, in fact, you actually read everything. Okay. I think, to be fair, there were a lot of people who just gave up on reading a lot of the things that came out early, and so a lot of people were very confused by the time the actual final documentation came out as to what they were actually supposed to do. And from our Montessori members, they wanted something tangible, yet again, to be able to look at the National Quality Framework within the Montessori context. So again, we developed a whole series of documentation, and this is pretty much, again, the way it looked. We looked at each quality area, we broke that down and talked about how we saw the similarities and whether or not that we saw that there was likely to be any difference or conflict in the way it was perceived by someone different. There was still a lot of people hanging on to the past, and particularly if any of you here have been through the old ACECQA accreditation system, there were many horror stories and many people who couldn't let that go. And one of the things that was really evident was that people who had been through that had found a way to control it, had found a way of finding their edges, because there was a whole lot of stuff you could prepare beforehand. You could have folders and you could have evidence and you could have your stuff ready to, pre-do. And of course what the NQS asks us to do is not do that because it's a completely different approach. And so a lot of people, a lot of the centre managers in particular, were feeling suddenly out of control. How do I do this? How do I manage this? Because I can't put my folders together anymore. So we wanted again to give people some sense of, well, there are some things that the assessors may not see, and there are some things that you can still prepare beforehand, and we want you to do that. So we tried to give back some control again, and one of the ways we did it through was this love at first sight documentation, where we listed what might be needed by an assessor, and then we asked them to have a look at how that related to the standards. We wanted then to find out, we wanted that to be a shared experience with the centres, so we asked the centres to identify whether all of the other centre staff had a look. Did everybody know about this? Did everybody know where to go to find those policies and so on? So again, giving back to the centres to do something themselves. And finally, a document called Bridging the Gap, which was the fact that although Montessori is now much more accepted in terms of people understanding us, there are some words that we use which are sort of Montessori speak. And so we were aware that we needed to be able to look at what the more typical, what the standards and what the assessors might typically say or want us to describe, that we might use different language for. And although we knew we were talking about the same thing, we needed to find a way to bridge the gap of that potential misunderstanding in order to find that in fact we were probably talking about exactly the same things. So we gave our Montessori people some language to use to bridge that gap. Just briefly, in the background of all of this, Montessori had created a document which is they had documented the whole of the Montessori curriculum from birth to 18, and that document had been submitted to ACECQA, which is the Australian Curriculum Assessment Reporting Authority, and that curriculum had been recognised as being one of only 3 curriculum alternatives in Australia. And we had tried to get the early years portion of that recognised with ACECQA as being perhaps an alternative framework. And although that was not successful, and we actually, as it happens, that it doesn't matter, that gave us an opportunity to open a lot of dialogue with ACECQA about Montessori, about our curriculum and what we were doing. And I think that was a really positive thing for bringing people together. So by the end of 2012, probably many of us were still in the situation you're in, that there'll always be some who, sabotage the change, there'll be some who will sit on the fence, there'll be others who will embrace it. So we realised that we couldn't just stop with what we'd done in that one round and the first round of information. What we needed to do was have ongoing support. and we created our first early childhood education and care Montessori conference, which was held in Adelaide, and we invited Karen Curtis and Alison Elliott as two of the presenters to address the audience. We also followed up in 2013 with a second series of workshops where Christine and I did the airport hopping again, and basically to find out some experiences, because by that time some of the centres had already been through an assessment. So we wanted to start collecting information and sharing with our colleagues what was happening. We again invited the assessment team to come and speak at those meetings, which they did, and of course everyone's confidence level and understanding had increased dramatically within that 12-month period. And we're following up again in 2014. We're having our second early childhood conference, which will be in the Gold Coast, which we invite you all to come to. So I guess for us, we've recognised that it does take people time to change, and you do have to remain positive, but you also have to listen to people who aren't quite there yet. You have to encourage those people to say, well, you know, you should give it a go, and you need to support the people on the way, and in fact you need to congratulate the people who've got there. So this is really just for you to decide yourselves. Some of you will be at the top, some in the middle, and maybe, I hope not, some at the bottom. That's our journey of change, and we're still going.
I'm sorry, just 2 seconds, really. I just wanted to sort of bring it all together and say that I think we achieved many things. A process which encouraged everyone to reflect on their practice. We empowered people, in the end, even better outcomes for children in a Montessori environment. And I couldn't help but reflect on what Mark McCrindle said this morning, which was there are things that come and go and things that stay, things that are more structural, and I think this applies to Montessori and to the NQF. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Barbara. Again, a fantastic presentation. I hope you're all taking notes. One of the things that's coming through is that, you know, we're not alone in this whole change thing, and that's exactly where we're heading next. Suzanne Blythen from Primary Oshcare will be talking about leading groups of people through change, and how do we, well, I'll let her talk about it. How do we, you know, we are not alone. How do you impart that upon other people? So would you please welcome Suzanne Blythen to the stage.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I believe that we're probably in a minority in that there are not too many delegates from the OSH sector, but I hope I speak for more than just a few. Oh, good, that's very reassuring. As you will know, but others might not, our industry has been unregulated until very recently, so the change process for us is indeed very immediate and current. We did not start to be modified under the regulations till January 2012. So our change is very much underway at the moment. We are very much in action. Our organisation has 23 OSH services, so I'm in a leading position, which is why I have to talk about a whole lot of things relating to a team of people and being responsible for trying to help those teams of people through a change process, which is really quite challenging and shocking. Indeed, today I'm going to talk about the shock of the new, making sense of what the NQF meant for our industry, strategies for that implementation and how we were going to do things around here, because obviously there was quite a lot to change, supporting the change in our teams, that's across the 23 different teams that we have in operation, and all of the successes and challenges that we faced along the way. I just wanted to start off by saying that I believe the NQF effectively simplifies the job that we all have to do as educators, which I know is contrary to what some of the people, certainly in my organisation, believe. But I believe that what the NQF does is gives us clear guidelines through the regulations, which support what is certainly my desire, and I'm sure most people who work in this sector, to create high quality working and learning environments for the staff, for the children and for families. I think certainly for the ACECQA, it has provided for probably the first time a framework for professional practice and informed approaches, which, you know, we've all tried to do through our policies and procedures, but are not always able to sustain and support those. Now we have a very clear framework that does do that. So we do believe change is for the better. Sometimes it's nasty, sometimes it's hard, sometimes people don't like it and they resist it, and we've heard about some of those people from previous speakers. We actually aim to be professional leaders in our field from when we first set up, which was in 2004, and it turns out I'm an early bloomer. So who knew? According to Karen, that's what I am. I put my hand up to be part of the pilot scheme for in 2010 for the NQF, and we really did believe at that stage that that would be a really helpful opportunity for us to be very confident that we were already meeting the standards. Little did we know, when we actually completed our first assessment visit at one of our services that had always received 100% quality rating under the NCAC process, we actually realised when we got the document through the post 2 weeks later that not only did we not achieve the excellent rating that we all expected, we actually were working towards the standards. That was a big shock for us. We thought we were doing everything really well. And I'm sure we were doing lots of things really well. I know that we were. But the major difference that we had, that we realised, the major learning, was that we didn't actually know what the NQS was to the same degree that we thought we did. So our initial response to that experience was to think, it's them. It's the assessors. They didn't understand what we were doing. They didn't understand what we were telling them. They didn't look for the things that we thought they should see. They misquoted us. They didn't listen to us properly. We were quite disgruntled when we got that outcome, I have to say, and it was a big shock for me because we all thought that we were doing really well. We felt a bit disheartened. We were a bit disgruntled. But after a while, we actually thought, okay, we know what we were doing right, but maybe we don't yet know what we're doing wrong. And that was the next learning for us. What do we need to do better so that we do actually understand the NQF better, so that next time we have those visits, we are actually achieving the outcome that we're hoping to. So we were lucky in the pilot scheme. We'd had access to a lot of information, languages, formats that were part of the NQF, which was coming in a year's time. And it gave us an opportunity to hopefully get ahead of the game a little bit. So what to do? I have a team of excellent managers who work with me very closely in the organisation, and they in turn work very closely with each of their coordinators in their service. One of the things they hear me say very often is, what is the outcome that you're looking for? We need to begin with the end in mind. So whatever you think you know, whatever you think that they should know, is irrelevant. What we need to know is what we're looking for at the end of the picture, at the end of the journey. I love Stephen Covey, that's his phrase, begin with the end in mind. So after the pilot visit, what we did was we set about embracing what we needed to do. What we need to do is continue to provide the same quality services that meet children's needs, that meet families' needs, that give staff the support and confidence to deliver the programs that they're delivering. But we need to do so in the context of the NQF. We had the realisation we were actually not doing that. So lots of things were needed. We needed to think about what we were doing. We needed to adapt and find new ways of working. Clearly, some of the things that we were doing were not quite to the standard in the language, in the format, in the way that we needed to do them. We needed to question and review and criticise, critically reflect on the things that we do. So we set ourselves the challenge, and we were very lucky in doing that, and we continue to be lucky because I have a team of professional people to work with, and we're not on the floor. And I do respect and understand that a lot of you people who work in industries are on the floor and don't necessarily have this advantage, but I urge you to try and find time, because it really is very helpful to be able to sit apart from the day-to-day operations and try and understand, and this is what we did, what are the bases for the regulations, for the guide, for the framework documents that we've got? What do we need to do and review in our current practice? What do we need to change? And essentially for us in January 2012, what were the most urgent of those changes that were needed? What we wanted to achieve was that the end of this, at the end of the process, although it's a continuing process of course, but in the immediate term we needed to have an entire team, and that is 160 to 180 educators, who are confident and comfortable in their role, that's number one, with a very clear understanding about what it is that they need to do, what are their responsibilities, and how that fits within the context of the NQF. But we also need to be NQF compliant in every single workplace, in every single centre. So it's a big undertaking. One of the things that we decided to do was to reassure everybody. Those of you who've been through the process more recently will recall there's a huge amount of loss of confidence for people who are suddenly being told that's not the right way, we're not doing that anymore. And that's really not, as previous speakers have said, that's really not the point. It's not about we're doing something wrong or we've failed, it's just that there's a change and we need to address the change and perhaps find a new way to do things. So the second thing was to find as many things as we possibly could, which we are currently doing, and reassure everyone that we can still do those things. And then to gradually introduce new ideas to educators which they can easily relate to and which would make them feel confident that what they're doing is okay. We wanted to avoid using terminology which was new and might freak them out, particularly things that we didn't actually understand ourselves yet, and offload also as much administrative burden as we could. We did start to receive service application approvals at that time, and I rather stupidly put up my hand and said, I'll just do those. That's a lot easier for you guys to be able to get on and do what you're doing in the centres. I'll fill those out. Do you know how long they are? They're about 26 pages each, and I did 23 of them. So not a good choice in retrospect, but at the time it felt like the right thing to do. We had a rather reassuring, ironically reassuring moment. We went to an early forum about the NQF, and one of the speakers there stood in my situation now and introduced herself, and she was able to remember her name, but she wasn't able to pronounce the name of the department that she now worked in or remember her title. And that was quite, as I say, quite reassuring in one context, because it made us realise that change was impacting on everybody. There were people in new departments everywhere, there were people in new agencies everywhere, there were people with new roles, new responsibilities. And it's very reassuring to be working in a system where everything is new. Governance is new, professionals are new, they've got new descriptions and new things to do, and that we all struggle to deal with change. I think it's fair to say that we know that children, we all work with children, often find change difficult. We try and minimise the change for children in our services because we know that it's hard and that it creates anxiety and tension. And I think it's important not to underestimate the fact that it does the same thing to us. It requires you to critically review and potentially reject the things that you know you've been doing well for a long time. It asks questions about what you're doing, it puts it in the spotlight, and it makes you acquire new skills that you didn't necessarily think you needed or know you had. So for us it was really important to help the people on the floor to feel confident that the things that they were going to be doing were achievable, but to keep them doing their job every day feeling empowered and confident. And we needed to help them and support them to do that as well as we possibly could. So, moving from theory to practice, and I've only got a few minutes left, I'll need to be quick. What was most important was we needed to understand the requirements, and we really did need to understand the requirements like we didn't know we did. So we decided to keep as much of the admin and external discovery away from the centres as possible, we decided to maintain, as a group of managers, most of the engagement with GEC and ACECQA and DEWA and all those convoluted agency names ourselves, and remove that burden from the people on the floor, to undertake who to speak to, who knows what, who do we get information from. We did that ourselves. We used the site visits that the GEC approvals officers afforded to us to get as much information and practical support as we could. We always came away from those visits with a whole new set of recommendations, a new policy inclusion, a better way of displaying information and so on. And it was reassuring during some of those times that we were told we were doing really well, we exceeded the expectations in some cases, etc., etc. We worked hard to manage the information flow, again, so that we weren't overwhelming people on the floor with lots of new information. We restricted our expectations of them in making changes themselves, and we gave trial tasks to people who we knew had the confidence and the experience to try them out, not people who didn't want to do it. We tried to alleviate panic. Panicking is really, really counterproductive. It doesn't help. It actually makes things worse. We've still got somebody who panics madly. She hands in a notice twice a week, and then she withdraws it again when she realises it's okay. I'm not joking, that happens. The thing that we did most comprehensively was invested an enormous amount of time in project planning. And this is an action plan that's ongoing to this day. Our initial draft was 14 pages long. It was put together over a weekend where all the managers and I went away, and we sat and we brainstormed absolutely everything that we knew already and all the things we had to do with that. And then it's continued to grow. Obviously, the more we find out, the more you find out, and so on and so on. So there was lots to do to gain a proper understanding of the things that we were intending to change, the things that we were doing well, and the things that we needed to do better. Ultimately, this process in particular, has kept us very focused and stimulated. There's nothing worse than having continuous worry in your head that you've missed something, that you've not addressed something, that you've forgotten something. And this process, as I say, it's continuous, really helps us feel confident at the end of it, when you've got the yellow highlights, which means you've done it, that you've actually made some change. And it's a really nice document to be able to bring out and share and remember that, yes, we've done all that. So when we make the changes, there are some key issues, and I just quickly want to go through this. I've got about 2 minutes left, I think 1 now, oh dear. Basically, breaking the things down, making changes, you need to identify what the workload is, you need to understand the size of the job, and you need to allocate appropriate time for it. You need to be clear about whose roles are which, how you're going to resource those roles, whether you can add additional hours, additional people to make those things happen. You need to be realistic. We couldn't expect our people to suddenly pick up and run with collegiality, intentionality, cultural competence. What's wrong with staff relationships, teaching, a multicultural approach? Well, there's nothing wrong with that, but the words are changing. Our culture has changed, our society has changed. So we have to be thoughtful and considered about how we're going to ask our people to learn those new things. That's what we're trying to do. Lastly, we try and provide a lot of support for our people. We give them lots of assistance. We try and minimise the stress levels that they've got and the perceived volume of change for our people. We try and give them assistance towards a better understanding. Practically speaking, and I'm nearly finished, I just want to endorse and advocate for the change that we're all going through. I think it's really useful for our industry that we've begun to move towards a much higher quality standard of childcare, certainly at OSH level. It's very reassuring to know that you're working with a team of people who've got a much greater understanding of their role and their responsibility. And now we're a little bit more on track, although we're not quite there yet. We just need to stay focused, and that's what staying aligned's about. So continuing to plan properly, continuing to meet regularly and communicate and collaborate, keep on devolving administration if you can to someone who is an administrator, rather than trying to do that concurrently with being on the floor and looking after children. Don't let up. Keep on going. I'm nearly finished, sorry. Perhaps the biggest challenge we face is empowering our educators to feel they can embrace change and make their own decisions about what's in the best interests of the children and families, and manage these interests with confident and enthusiastic staff. Challenging, but with significant outcomes. Organisationally and from a team and an individual point of view, I have to say the process of change in this instance has really benefited our organisation from a growth, capacity and professional aspect. We are ready for the challenges of the inevitable structural changes the industry will face with new government and industry evolution. We really want to make the changes positive. That's some guidelines for you to keep on going if you want to keep on going. Finally, I want to say to you that it's really, really important. Just get to my last page, I'm having to skip a few. That you create an action plan, a project plan, allocate resources, develop working parties, consider organisational structure, enlist outside help, protect your front line from the onerous responsibility and from failure. And finally, and most importantly, celebrate the success. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. There's going to be a lot of celebrating going on. We've got to celebrate change, we've got to celebrate success. So we're going to move on, and it's wonderful to have Heather Barnes join us, an early childhood education and care consultant and trainer, to look at the very important role that professional development plays in the whole area of change. So I've noticed that Heather's raring to go, so would you please welcome Heather Barnes.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I'm absolutely thrilled and feel very privileged to be part of this session and of this conference as a whole, as I'm an absolute fan of the National Quality Framework. Before I begin my section, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and to pay my respects to the elders, the traditional owners of this land who have raised children, taught them about the world around them and bestowed on them the gift of culture and language. I'm going to focus in my session on the importance of continuously focusing on quality improvement in all sectors of our profession: family daycare, long day care, outside school hours care, and of course preschools, to identify those further changes that might be needed. I'm hoping to encourage you to maintain the momentum before and after the assessment and rating visit, and I'm hoping to encourage you to join me in being very excited about the changes that are part of the National Quality Framework. Many of you will have seen these objectives and guiding principles before. If you haven't seen them, they're in guide number 2 of the big blue folder. You all know the one I'm talking about, don't you? The NQF resource kit that ACECQA sent out to all services. And so some of these guiding principles and objectives are on this slide. And of course, as we look at them, we're reminded about the importance of improving outcomes for children. We're reminded about promoting continuous improvement. And we're also reminded about the importance of best practice. So now let's look at some of the reasons why we might need to stay focused on continuous improvement. The first reason, of course, is that we all need to have a quality improvement plan. And those quality improvement plans need to be dynamic, evolving documents. In other words, just because they're written doesn't mean that they sit in a filing cabinet. That actually we need to be starting to work and focus on improving, on identifying the goals, continuing to identify goals and actively work towards those quality improvements, while at the same time continuously reflecting against the elements of the NQF in order to identify whether there are any further issues that need to be incorporated into the quality improvement plan. Standard 7.2, of course, in the National Quality Standard reminds us that there needs to be a commitment to continuous improvement, and element 7.2.3 spells that out in that you need to have an effective self-assessment and quality improvement process in place. Whenever new staff join a service, they bring with them, don't they, experiences and beliefs and values and ideas that might be different to the service that they're joining now. And that can sometimes encourage further reflection and result in changed practices. One of the irritating things is when they say, "At my old service we used to," and that can be a little hard. But at the same time, those new members need to take on board the existing culture of that organisation that they're joining and to understand the reasons behind the practices that are being undertaken. We also know, don't we, that when there are new children and families joining a service, that can trigger change. Encouraging feedback from families about their experiences of enrolment or orientation can sometimes lead to changed practice. Learning about and incorporating cultural backgrounds of children and families might require change in practice, but it also adds huge richness to the curriculum, doesn't it? Sometimes undertaking professional learning, whether it's reading, attending workshops and so on, results in new ideas that can provide a catalyst for change. One of the hardest part for people like me that provide professional learning opportunities is to keep the shutters up. Sometimes when I'm proposing new ideas, I can almost see the shutters going down. People are not ready to embrace some of those ideas. The last point on that slide, of course, focuses on the importance of best practice, that it doesn't just happen, that we need to be able to continuously reflect on our practices to make sure that we're on track and to make sure that there are not further changes that are required. Some of you will remember this quote from the frameworks. It's in both the EYLF and the Framework for School Aged Care, My Time, Our Place. And this quote is actually focusing on outcomes for educators, that as a result of undergoing continuous reflection, yes, there will be challenge, but often great motivation and satisfaction arises from that contemplation. So as others have noted already today, we know that the National Quality Framework is a great tool for change. And reflecting on each of those elements has encouraged services around the countries to identify issues that have led to improvements. I'm very fortunate to be able to work in lots of different states and territories around the country, and I was able to collect some stories from services in lots of different places, which I compiled into one of those little ECA Research in Practice booklets, Critical Reflection as a Tool for Change, Stories of Quality Improvement. And I was very chuffed to see that it was in the book garden before, but you can access it through the ECA online bookshop as well. So some of the changes that I've noticed and that are which I've collected in that little booklet, and I've only focused on 4, there are more in the booklet, but the first focus that was really significant was how services have adjusted to the change in approach in staff meetings. So many of them have realised that the importance of critical reflection means we've got to ditch the housekeeping. We actually have to find other ways of transferring information about those sort of details and use those times when teams come together as an opportunity to focus more on continuous reflection. At Walgaroo Village Kids Childcare Centre in Townsville, they changed the name of their staff meeting to a team meeting to better reflect the way they work together. And everyone after the team meeting is given an opportunity to reflect on and share feedback about what worked well and where to next. And they were particularly asked to think about one thing that they would take from their team meeting and implement in their work. We know that many people in this auditorium today and many other services around the country are reviewing their approach to documentation and planning. And of course, the biggest change for many people was incorporating the elements of the approved learning framework into the documentation. And a much stronger focus on intention. Not just following children's interest, but intentionally supporting children's learning. And this is just an example in the top right-hand slide of the way the service in Melbourne at the Royal Children's Hospital has revamped and revised the way they document. They were very keen to assure me that they're still on the journey. They don't know that they've got it right yet, but this is where they're up to. Quality Area 3 has encouraged many services to incorporate more sustainable practices, hasn't it? And embracing environmental awareness. And this little display in the bottom left corner was at Community Children in Wyndham Vale, which they set up to provoke children's interest and understanding about the importance of collecting rainwater. The last slide there on the bottom right-hand corner was about an example of one way a service in Darwin, Malak Childcare Centre, was focusing on improvements in their outdoor learning space. They actually sought funding through a Green Thumb Kids project to be able to incorporate ideas from children and families in order to create more interesting environments for children, which resulted in vegetable gardens and bush tucker gardens. So I'm now going to move on to talk about the changes in relation to assessment and rating. And one of the things that I think is really important is that when you get your assessment and rating report, that it's really helpful to focus firstly on the positive feedback that's been provided by the assessor. Because although there are suggestions for improvement usually in each of the reports, it's really important to affirm what you're currently doing and that can be shared together. I loved what Karen said earlier about, celebrate the things that you're proud of. If there are recommendations for inclusion in the quality improvement plan, of course those need to be acted upon, don't they? And they provide a focus for change in practice. If the overall rating is disappointing, and as Suzanne just said, it's natural, isn't it, to feel disgruntled or a little bit disappointed, then it's really, I think, encouraging to just focus on the fact that this is a new system. Everybody's still learning the ropes. It is an aspirational system. The bar has been raised, but once you know the areas that you need to focus on, you can just get on with it now, can't you? It helps to remember about the saying about eating a big elephant, that you need to just focus on one bite at a time. The professional support coordinators in each state and territory are there to support people who need assistance. If you are meeting NQS, celebrate. There you are, there's that word again. We need to say you are doing a wonderful job. It's a good idea to review the descriptors under each of the elements of the NQS assessment and rating report, contact other services, share, network, see what other people are doing, and of course access professional development as well. So if you're able to reach exceeding NQS, then you celebrate really wildly and look back and celebrate how far you've come. You've put an enormous amount of work into receiving that. And of course, think about applying for the excellent rating as well. In the latest ACECQA newsletter, you will have noticed that you don't have to have exceeding in every quality area in order to apply for the excellent rating. So we know that meeting all of these changes requires a lot of work-life balance, which can be tricky at times, can't it? And we know that people react very differently to change. And when I was thinking about what Karen was saying earlier, I was thinking of this slide and thinking, yeah, I can see some early bloomers and some late bloomers in there. We know that there will be some people that are going to stick their head in the sand and not embrace the changes. But you know what? The NQF is here to stay. And I, like many of you in this auditorium, will be lobbying very hard to ensure that our NQF is not watered down or delayed. There is an expectation that everyone embraces the approved learning frameworks, understands the requirements of the national law and the national regulations, and stays focused on meeting the national quality standard. And as Karen said earlier, if people are not prepared to do that, they have a choice. And of course, that is get off at the next exit. So, like many of you in this place, I truly believe that the National Quality Framework is the most important initiative that I have seen in over 40 years in the early childhood profession. And people who are attending this conference and others like you around the country are responding incredibly well to the changes. They're focusing on continuous quality improvement every single day so that every child, in no matter what setting, in every state and territory, are resulting in improved learning outcomes for children. So thank you very much for listening, and very best wishes for maintaining best quality practice.
Thank you very, very much, Heather. There was another celebrating there. We've got to celebrate how proud we are as well, which I think is fantastic. We're going to make a slight step sideways yet again, and we're going to look at the positive change that SNAICC is making for Indigenous children and families. And to present this, would you please welcome Geraldine Atkinson from SNAICC.
Before I begin, I too would like to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Gadigal people, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. I realise that we're running out of time, and I'm going to be very careful, and I've tried to sort of go through and flick through a lot that I'm not going to say, but I hope that I get there. And thank you very much for staying and listening. I want to talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander services that are funded under the budget-based funding program. Quite a few of them are, and while these services come under national law, they are not currently included within national regulations. They are therefore not assessed according to the national quality standards. However, this is to be revised by DWA in 2014, with a strong possibility that they may become streamlined. So in light of these factors, it's really important to consider the cultural competence of the National Quality Standard as it stands, and in order to understand if it is in any way culturally inappropriate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander services, and if so, to suggest pathways to ensure that it can be applied in a culturally competent way. This presentation starts to explore what cultural competence means in this context and the extent to which the National Quality Standard is culturally competent. This is something that needs to be taken on from the national to the local level, so it also provides some recommendations and tools for consideration at the national level by ACECQA and at the local level by services themselves. This hopes to be a starting point for a genuine discussion and consultation on the importance of cultural competence and how we can support a culturally strong approach to early childhood education and care for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander services and children. In addressing the cultural competence of the National Quality Standard, there are several interrelated terms that require clear definition. SNAICC draws upon a human rights-based framework to describe these terms and their components. Self-determination is the overarching right of Indigenous people to exercise control over the decisions that affect their lives, and also have the right to choose and have a voice in receiving culturally appropriate services. Aboriginal community self-determination must drive and direct the identification or provision of these services. Participation encompasses a broad range of active engagement in public decision-making process, which requires a shift in power dynamics, so the party with control over decisions enables influence of others. Applying an understanding of participation to the context of Indigenous peoples requires an appreciation of their unique rights to participation in decisions as distinct cultural groups, their special place as an original inhabitants of lands, and their shared history of colonisation and disempowerment in public decision-making. It requires recognition that cultural values that underpin public institutions and systems have been largely shaped without equal participation of Indigenous people. Therefore, participation on equal terms must therefore allow for systems of cultural change rather than simply including Indigenous people within existing mainstream systems and processes. Both participation and self-determination are required elements of cultural competence. And cultural competence is not about having a general idea about cultural differences. It requires a specific knowledge of the history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the effects of colonisation and the stolen generations. It requires a commitment to working in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to produce services, programs, policies and processes that make it possible for our cultures to thrive and pursue our right to culture, identity and participation. At the core of cultural competence is a commitment to Aboriginal self-determination and respectful partnerships. From these aspects, each other feature of cultural competence becomes possible. Without this commitment, it is not possible to create an environment where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people feel culturally safe and respected, and where it is possible for us to go about our service delivery in a culturally appropriate way. Other fundamental aspects of cultural competency are as outlined as you will see. The concept of cultural competency is complex and interwoven. It is not a quick fix or tick the box issue, but it's a journey for individuals and organisations to invest in. It's a multifaceted and requires time and consideration of all of these components. Developing cultural competency is a process of integrating attitudes, values, knowledge, understanding and skills that enable effective interventions with people from cultures other than one's own. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander service have a particular history and defined features that stem from culture. The importance of culture to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is described, as you can see, beautifully by Muriel Bamblett. The right to preserve culture is enshrined in international human rights instruments to which Australia is a signatory, including the United Nations Convention to the Rights of the Child, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. International human rights instruments make it clear that the right of everyone to take part in cultural life is fundamentally linked to the rights to education, through which individuals and communities pass their values, religion, customs, language and other cultural references, and which helps to foster an atmosphere of mutual understanding and respect for cultural values. The right to education requires that all our children have access to quality and cultural appropriate education. They also have the right to equal access to culturally appropriate early childhood education, which begins at birth and is intrinsically linked to maximum development. And this requires positive measures for them to enjoy full enjoyment of this right. And these rights are in particular the right to culture. They require a mechanism and process for realisation. This is now recognised under the National Policy Reform Agenda, which is increasingly enshrined in law and policy, and the necessity of a culturally competent approach to achieving targeted outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. At the national policy level, there is a recognition that the absence of genuine engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as well as a lack of cultural competence, is a barrier for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in accessing and remaining in services. As well as for government to achieve its own policy objectives, there is also a recognition that cultural competency in this context is a complex process that requires specific attention to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The national framework which guides policy programs and practices targeting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, including early childhood education care services, largely stem from and are designed to implement the Closing the Gap reform agenda, which I'm sure that you, and I hope that you've all heard of. So you will see there that you'll see there are a broad range of instruments to assist in closing the gap for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And each of these instruments contains strong principles, targets, strategies and priorities that place central importance on working in respectful partnerships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and using strategies which increase Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander independence, empowerment and self-management. Systems and processes established that contribute to closing the gap outcomes include early childhood development and education outcomes, and need to incorporate and give life to those principles and strategies. With this in mind, I would now like to explore the cultural competency of the National Quality Framework, and in particular the National Quality Standards. The National Quality Framework actually does provide the impetus for a culturally competent process through one of its guiding principles, that Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures are valued. However, currently there is no provision in the National Quality Framework or the National Quality Standards for how this principle might be achieved or operational. Where Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander culture is mentioned in the NQFF and the NQS, the context in mainstream services and the inclusion of Aboriginal culture into their service provision. There is nothing specific to cultural competence with respect to Aboriginal people or services. There is also no reference to the National Indigenous Policy Agenda to redress Indigenous disadvantage. In Quality Area 6, Collaborative Partnerships with Families and Communities, it explicitly mentions Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and cultures. There is one element of one standard in Quality Area 6 that is relevant to our people and cultures. The standard is, the service collaborates with other organisations and service providers to enhance children's learning and well-being. The element is, the service builds relationships and engages with the local community. In assessing against this element, assessors are not in any way, however, assessing the cultural competence of the organisation or its workers. They are evaluating positive responses to differences between children and an environment that reflects diversity. The emphasis is on raising awareness of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures rather than more detailed and deeper ideas of cultural competence and engagement. National Quality Area 1, however, recognises the central importance of the development of a cultural competence by non-Indigenous people and organisations. The Early Years Learning Framework, the approved learning framework that forms the basis of Quality Area 1 of the National Quality Standard, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural competence, is a concept of this framework. The guide to the EYLF highlights several crucial notions regarding cultural competence. That cultural competence in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is distinctly different from the broad idea of respecting all cultures. That acknowledgement of Indigenous ancestral relatedness, its values and how these are realised is distinctly Australian. That the Early Years Learning Framework provides an opportunity for educators across Australia to work towards cultural security for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and their families. While inclusion of cultural competence here is significant, the silence of the National Quality Standard itself on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural competence still does undermine its guiding principle to value Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. The EYLF applies only to one quality area only of the National Quality Standards and does not provide a mechanism or tool for implementing the guiding principle. The absence of cultural competence criteria is associated with application of the National Quality Standards has two implications. First, there is no process for assessing and ensuring cultural competence of mainstream organisations. That's including service providers as well as ACECQA and its delegates. Second, there is no process for ensuring that the National Quality Standard is applied in a culturally appropriate manner for any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander service. A cultural competence framework provides a mechanism necessary to bridge this gap in cultural competence for the National Quality Standard. I'm getting behind here, trying to hurry and read. As you can see, this is the accepted framework for cultural competence. It's the Victorian Aboriginal and Childcare framework, which comprises comprehensive cultural competence criteria and an assessment tool for assessing the cultural competence of services against their child and family service standards. It's based on the idea that resilience results from cultural safety, and cultural safety is a responsibility and the right for Aboriginal communities and their children. The Aboriginal Childcare Agency also has developed a matrix, and as you can see there, that it functions as a tool for ongoing self-assessment of an agency's cultural competence, and the matrix delineates 6 distinct assessments of an agency's or individual's organisation's cultural competency. This framework provides a really useful and practical basis to look specifically at the different aspects of the National Quality Standards and its assessment process. So SNAIC has started to break down the different aspects and identify some strengths and opportunities for strengthening cultural competency. This matrix details how the different processes of the national... should have gone back, but never mind, there we go, back there, and identify some strengths and opportunities for strengthening cultural competence. This matrix details how the different processes of the National Quality Standard rate against the different elements of the Victorian Aboriginal Childcare Agency's cultural competence framework. And we have a complete matrix as a handout, but given time restraints, I'm just going to briefly talk about how it relates, the NQSS and how it rates against the specific elements. So at the heart of it, it would be really strong development in the National Quality Standards and a means to operationalise the guiding principles on valuing Aboriginal culture is to support a cultural lens. According to ACECQA, there are 2 aspects of the National Quality Framework that are shared or common. There is a common language for educators and officers to use and a shared understanding of what quality education and care should look like. So reflecting on the cultural competence framework, however, confirms that it's not enough to use the National Quality Standard itself to provide this common language and shared understanding. In itself, the National Quality Standard does not work towards producing a language or an understanding that is shared between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and in non-Indigenous peoples or agencies. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander early education providers cannot offer culturally embedded services and meet the National Quality Standards unless the rating and assessment tool and process is capable of rating and assessing them through a cultural lens. A systemic and committed approach to having a culturally competent process is essential. There must be an approach to rating and assessment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander services that uses these cultural ways of defining, transmitting and valuing to determine what in the services needs improvement and what doesn't, and otherwise the rating and assessment of services as both potential to damage cultural identity and cultural involvement and more broadly undermine Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. A common language and shared understanding cannot be taken for granted between non-Indigenous people or agencies, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It requires significant work, training, commitment on the part of both educators and officers. To date, this work's not been done. And if a common language and a shared understanding are not reached, then the NQF is not fulfilling its own guiding principles of valuing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. A genuine common language can only be devised by looking through a cultural lens. Developing cultural competence requires mainstream organisations to widen the lens through which they look at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander services to include our perspectives. It is necessary that government processes take account of this cultural lens when it comes to assessing, planning and acting to promote an Aboriginal child's safety, stability and development. Similarly, preserving and enhancing the quality of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander childcare services cannot be done without looking at those services through that cultural lens. So seeing through a cultural lens is a tool to interpret and assess. It is the acknowledgement that each act of interpretation and assessment has a cultural dimension. Applying a cultural lens has multiple implications. It's not only about how to view Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and culture, but it's also how to understand the unrecognised and unanalysed assumptions in current or mainstream ways of looking. The ongoing process of colonisation takes a different shape to the one it had in the past. Today it takes the form of a cross-cultural blindness. Cross-cultural blindness is the opposite of seeing through a cultural lens. It is not only the failure to see the positive value of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, but it's also the failure to see the indirect or systemic continuation of colonising and practices. One of the effects of cross-cultural blindness is the disempowerment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and organisations. Cultural blindness determines what you see when you look at Aboriginal people. Cultural blindness is seeing the stereotypes and mistaking it for the truth. This is because of the cultural misunderstanding caused by the lack of cross-cultural knowledge and competence. Okay, I'm just trying to hurry this up a little bit here. Oh, okay. So how do we achieve a cultural lens? Non-Aboriginal people and agendas cannot just decide to look through that lens. Being able to see through that lens requires knowledge, understanding and, crucially, the assistance of Aboriginal people building genuine relationships. The second of the two key cultural competencies is the key. So we're recommending that, considering the different aspects of the national quality standards and cultural competence, we propose 15 key recommendations to support the development of a culturally competent framework for the national quality standards and offers a framework to support services to consider incorporation of cultural competence within the application of the national quality standards. These recommendations are covered in a table format that identifies SNAIC's concern, a recommendation outcome based on the uptake of the recommendation. Everyone has been provided with a copy of this table. Well, we're hoping we'll take you through. I won't take you through the recommendations. We'll look at those later. Also essential is how it is implemented by services at the local level, and I'm talking about using our cultural framework, offers a potential matrix that could support services to analyse how the cultural competence framework can be applied to its implementation of the national quality standard. The handout provided shows an example of what this could look like for the quality area 1. This may be useful for regulatory bodies and assessors to support them to understand cultural competence and some of the nuances in considering quality in diverse Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander contexts. So I'd like to as I say, I just want to introduce this tool to you that SNAICA has developed to support early childhood educators to unpack what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people when they refer to culture and cultural needs. Our Children's Cultural Needs resource, which we have some copies of here, portrays different aspects of cultural connections that enhance young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' persons' sense of identity and well-being. It acknowledges the diversity within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. I'll skip that. So what I might just say then is that each element of this flip chart provides space for writing about reflective practice to fill in thoughts and ideas on the key issues of focus, including the history, personal identity, extended family and community, land and water, cultural expression, cultural values, beliefs and practices. And there are some suggestions, questions and ideas to assist when reflecting on practice and how to support each individual Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child. And I hope that this resource will be useful to professionals providing early childhood education and care to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. It includes practical information, better understanding of some of the specific cultural needs of our children, and will assist you to improve your practices by integrating these cultural needs. And it's available online, and I hope that you'll find it very useful, and just ask that you circulate it widely. Okay? Tried to hurry as fast as I could. Okay.
Thank you so much for those fascinating and engaging presentations. Thank you, Carolyn, Christine, Barbara, Suzanne, Heather and Geraldine for such insightful presentations. It's really heartening to see how really different members of the sector bring their expertise and their broad and varied backgrounds to embrace the changes that have been brought about by the National Quality Framework. It's amazing to see the work that's going on around the country. Thank you.